Thank you all for coming along. So I don't need to tell you guys that inequality is an important, interesting and policy relevant issue, and I'm here to basically give you the headlines on what inequality's kind of done over the last few decades in Australia. If you're here to hear about what has caused inequality to go up or down, you're going to be really disappointed. But I think Professor Borland and Edwards are going to talk more about the actual drivers of inequality in Australia. So this is just like an overview of what's been happening to inequality to kick things off. I note the disclaimer that these are my views and not the views of the RBA. So it's not just us in this room that are interested in inequality. It turns out that everyone's kind of interested in inequality. So the left-hand panel of this graph shows you the number of Google searches for the word inequality over the past decade or so. And you can see it's gone up, particularly in the last few years. You won't be surprised to learn that that roughly coincides with the time that Thomas Piketty's famous book on inequality came out. So everyone's talking about it, and it's an important topic. And following that public interest, there's also more academic interest in inequality, which again probably won't surprise many of you. So I've tried to come up with a measure through Google Scholar of the number of research articles that are actually about inequality, and that you can see again over the last few years it's gone up quite a lot. So everyone's talking about it, and we kind of wanted to get in on that action too. So also one other thing I wanted to point out, so this is an interesting global survey, the International Social Survey, that I wasn't actually aware of. Now the data are a little bit dated. The most recent data here is for 2009. But actually there's a question in this survey, and they asked thousands of people around the world this particular question: do you think income differences are too large? And what's shown there in the left panel for Australia is the proportion of Australians that think income differences in Australia are too large. And you can see it's been rising over the past few decades. A bit over 70% of people think that income inequality is too big in Australia. The other thing I find interesting here is that the share of Australians that think inequality is a problem is much higher than the share of Americans. But as many of you will know, inequality is much higher in America than in Australia. So to give you an overview of what I'm actually going to talk about today, as I said, I'm going to talk about this thing called household economic inequality. So there's a lot of work being done on income inequality, some work done on wealth inequality, and there's also been in the past work done on consumption inequality, inequality in household spending. And I'm going to, this household economic inequality concept sort of encompasses all three things. It's like a catch-all phrase for income, wealth, and consumption. So I'm going to talk about the trends in these things over recent decades. As I said, it's a hot topic, that's why we wanted to do it. And as some of you may know, it's also an interesting topic for central bankers. And we've got a bunch of papers at the RBA that have recently been published. This paper I'm talking about today came out about 2 years ago on the RBA website. Subsequently, we've done other work looking at how the income distribution affects the sensitivity of the economy to changes in interest rates and stuff. So there's a lot of work being done within central banks on inequality. So what do we do in this paper? As I said, we're going to look at three components of inequality: income, consumption, and wealth. That's not to say that there's not other important forms of inequality, but these are the three that we focus on in the paper. And we have a particular focus actually on consumption inequality. So the idea here is that consumption is a sort of better measure of welfare. It's a thing that goes into people's utility functions in standard economic theory. It's a better measure of how well off you are, living standards, better measure than say income or wealth. You can also think of it as kind of a function of both income and wealth. And you can think of it, in standard economic theory would say consumption is a function of permanent income. So looking at trends in consumption inequality will tell you something about trends in permanent income inequality. Now we're going to look at this in two different ways. The first way is through repeated snapshots from a particular survey, which some of you will be familiar with, the Household Expenditure Survey. This has been out every 5 or 6 years on average since the 1970s. We've got the most recent data for 2009 and 10, so it's a little bit dated, but we're going to have a new snapshot in about a month or two, 2015-16. And this is a survey of about 10,000 households each year. So the households that are surveyed keeps changing over time. But they ask people about their spending patterns, what they're spending their money on, how much income they have, and so forth. And then we're going to complement that with some analysis from the Hilda survey, which is a panel survey where you're actually tracking households over time. And there's information there on income and spending and wealth as well. And what's going to be interesting is that the results from these two approaches, completely different data sets, are going to be quite complementary. All right, but firstly I need to start off with a slightly nerdy thing that statisticians kind of get excited about, but hopefully I can get you excited about as well, is this concept called imputed rent, because it's going to be important in a lot of stuff that we do today. So as the Household Expenditures Survey's name suggests, it's about measures of expenditure, not necessarily measures of consumption. And statisticians in particular worry a lot about how you convert from expenditure to consumption. And I won't go into all the details, but the main difference between these two things is how you treat the imputed rent of owner-occupiers. This is the rent that a homeowner effectively pays to themselves. So as a homeowner, you are effectively the tenant and the landlord of your own home. And it's really important that you treat these two groups, renters and homeowners, in a very similar way when looking at measures of inequality and stuff. So what I'll show you firstly is actually how much imputed rent matters for the aggregate economy. Just looking at the overall budget constraint for an average person, this imputed rent thing matters. And then I'm going to show you how it's important for the distribution. So here's a graph showing you, based on the national accounts data, what has happened over the past 50 years or so in the amount of spending, amount of your budget going to rent and to imputed rent. So the rent is the orangey line at the bottom. You can see it's gone up a little bit since the 60s, but over the past few decades, it's been pretty flat. About 5% of spending is on market rent or for tenant-occupied kind of rent. The bigger chunk, and the one that's trending up over time, is the imputed rent. And you can speculate as to why there's kind of these differences between the two things. It's due to differences in like home ownership rates and the quality of the homes that owners and renters live in. But you can see it's now the biggest component of household spending in the national accounts, imputed rent. So this thing matters, so adjusting for it matters. And normally in household surveys, they don't have direct measures of this thing, so we have to construct our own measures. So it's going to matter for the distribution of income and spending as well as the overall level. But we need to estimate it. So we need to come up with a way of measuring rents. And what we want to do is, if you can imagine two people living right next door to each other, exact same home, same street, one person's renting, one person's owning. You want to be able to sort of impute the rent of the person renting to the person that's owning and say, all right, how much of your home's value do you sort of eat up each year? How much of the service flow are you consuming each year? There's a whole bunch of ways in which you can measure that, and we go into that in the paper. I'm going to focus on a super simple way of doing it here, which is just taking 5% of the value of the home that these people live in. So in this survey, you get asked, what do you think your home is worth? And they'll say like $1 million, and we'll just take 5% of that as their imputed rent, how much rent they are paying to themselves to live in that home. And then, don't worry too much about this, but we also subtract out things like mortgage payments and stuff to get a measure of net imputed rent. It's the thing that we're going to focus on. And so basically the difference between consumption and expenditure in this paper is this net imputed rent component. And we're also going to adjust income for net imputed rent. So this adjustment doesn't matter for renters, it only matters for homeowners. So here's the headlines of what's happened to inequality both in income and in consumption over the last few decades according to this household expenditure survey. So this is the Gini coefficient. I don't find it a very intuitive way of thinking about inequality, so I'll show you another measure in a minute. But basically what it's showing is that inequality has gone up regardless of which kind of measure you look at. Since the 80s and 90s, expenditure inequality has gone up, consumption inequality has gone up, disposable income inequality has gone up. Other things to notice that income inequality tends to be higher than consumption inequality. So if you think of consumption as being like the permanent component to income, the difference between those two things is due to kind of temporary income shocks. I'll come and talk about that a little bit later. And the other thing to notice is that the adjustment for net imputed rent actually reduces the level of inequality by quite a bit. It actually lowers it, and I'll get into why that is. It's not necessarily intuitive. Here's another way I find it a little bit more intuitive to think about what's happened to inequality in Australia based on these two measures. Let's focus on the right panel first, the income inequality estimates. So this is showing you how much, looking right across the distribution from the poorest people on the left to the richest people on the right. You can see that the top 1% of the distribution, the richest people, have seen the fastest real income growth between 1993 and 2009. So over that period, their income grew by a bit over 5% in real terms. The rest of the people living in the top 10% of the income distribution have also seen pretty good growth in incomes. People further down the distribution have seen less real income growth. And you see that in Australia, you see it in the US. Interestingly, you also see this when you look at consumption inequality, the more permanent component to income. Again, it's the biggest spenders that have been driving overall consumption. So the top 1% have seen their spending grow by more than 4% each year for the past 20 years or so. And again, the same kind of pattern for people that spend less. And again, you can see that difference between income and consumption growth, inequality growth. Now, getting into why this imputed rent thing matters and more generally how housing price changes actually can affect inequality is, I think, interesting. So it's kind of got a direct effect on wealth inequality. So that won't surprise you that the wealthiest households tend to own more housing than least wealthy households. So when house prices go up, they see their wealth rise compared to everyone else. That leads to an increase in wealth inequality. But perhaps a little bit perplexingly, it actually works the other way when you make this adjustment for net imputed rent. When house prices go up and rents go up and imputed rents go up, it actually reduces the level of income and consumption inequality in the economy. So basically, changes in housing prices have very different effects on inequality depending on which kind of measure you're most interested in, whether you're interested in wealth or income or consumption. Now, why is that? Let's focus just on the right panel of this graph. I think it really draws out the key difference between the income and the wealth distributions here. So this is the home ownership rate, the proportion of people across the distribution that own their own homes. And what you see, so let's focus on the purple bars. So this is looking at the income distribution. So we're going from poorest to richest from left to right, but we're looking specifically at the income distribution. So you can see that the home ownership rate's pretty similar across the whole income distribution, a little bit above 60% right across the board. So the poorest people in terms of income actually have fairly high rates of home ownership. The picture looks very different though when you look at the distribution of wealth. So the people in the poorest wealth quintile have basically no housing at all. And what I'm getting at here is that the lowest wealth people, least wealthy people, are very different to the people on lowest income. People with low incomes tend to be disproportionately represented by sort of elderly, retired homeowners, people that actually own their own homes, so they do have some housing wealth. Whereas the least wealthy tend to be young people who are renting. They might have quite a bit of income, but they just have no wealth. And so when house prices change, it affects the bottom of those two distributions very differently. As house prices go up, it is good for the people, the low income people, but not necessarily the low wealth people. So it drives quite interesting differences in inequality. So putting all that to one side now and focusing on the Hilda survey, a completely different approach to looking at inequality. We're going to be looking at basically the dynamics of it. So what's good about this survey, what you couldn't do in the previous survey, is actually track people across time. You can see what happens to their income as they enter unemployment or as they get a promotion. You can see what happens to them over time. And what we do here, we're going to throw some funky statistical models at this and that have been used in the literature to kind of decompose people's incomes into things that are due to observable characteristics about them, so whether their education, their age, but also we're going to look at their unobserved components of income as well. And we're going to decompose that into sort of persistent components and transitory components. So what do I mean by that? So a persistent shock to your income would be something like a promotion or a long-term health condition, which means that your income's affected for a fair amount of time. We're going to look at the distribution of those kinds of shocks. We're also going to look at transitory shocks, which is where you have a sort of short-term spell of unemployment, or maybe you got a bonus just for 1 year and then it goes away. And we're going to look at the distribution of that and how it changes over time. So one thing to keep in mind in trying to tie this analysis to what I just showed you before on consumption and stuff, think of the persistent income bit as being a bit like the consumption inequality bit. If you think of consumption as being like permanent income. So here's a graph showing a slightly different way of measuring inequality, so the variance of income in the Hilda survey. You can see, again, it's going up over time, so a completely different measure. This is not a Gini coefficient, it's the variance of the log of income, but it's just another way of measuring inequality. It's gone up over time, just like you see in the household expenditure survey, just like you see in tax record data. It doesn't matter what you look at. But the interesting contribution here is to decompose that into the bit that's due to changes over time in people's observed characteristics. So things like an aging population or the rise in educational attainment, those things are controlled for in the greenish line at the bottom. So you can see that's gone up a little bit over time. But the thing that's really gone up is the residual inequality, the stuff that's due to components of income that we don't observe in the data. So things that it's not age, it's not what industry you work in, what occupation you work in, it's not about where you live, it's just something unobserved about the individual. That's gone up the most over time. but is it permanent or is it transitory? We then come up with this error components model. I won't go through all the details. If you're interested, please come and see me afterwards. We model it in a particular way. We look at the persistent components like an AR1 process, the transitory component as an MA process, throw some GMM estimation at this thing, and we get this graph basically. So the main thing to focus on is the persistent and the transitory bits. And what you can see here is when we decompose inequality, it's over the last decade or so, it's gone up both because of this transitory income inequalities. So these are potentially things that you might be less worried about, the bonuses and things and the short-term spells of unemployment. But what's also gone up over the past decade or so is persistent income inequality. And that's consistent with what you see on the consumption inequality side. So if you care about living standards and you care about welfare, this persistent thing might actually be a better guide to what's been happening to inequality. So as I said, this is just giving you the headlines on what's been happening to inequality over recent decades, and then my colleagues will go through the details of what's sort of been driving these things in a little bit more detail. So the headlines are that based on these household surveys, income and consumption inequality have gone up since at least the early 90s, with income inequality going up by a little bit more. And when you decompose it using, when you look at the dynamics of income inequality, we see it's due to both transitory and persistent components. But interesting, over the past decade or so, the persistent thing has become slightly more important. So if you care about living standards, it looks like there's become more and more inequality in living standards in Australia over recent years. And finally, just pointing out that how you think about housing and housing expenditure and housing income really matters to the distribution of income and how you think about inequality. And that's me. Thank you.
Thanks for your talk. It was really interesting. My name's Louise Rawlings. I'm from the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. I'm just interested in this dot point here where you're talking about the return to unobserved skills. Can you talk about what you mean by that?
Yeah, sorry, in the interest of time, I actually skipped over that. It's a slightly technical point on, let me go back to this. If you don't mind, I'm going to get my nerd on and talk about the equation here. So we get our income data from this Hilda survey, and we sort of look at how much of it's due to things like age and education and all that sort of stuff. And then we run this simple OLS regression, and we get residual bit. And then what we do is break it up into these three components. One is this thing called what we're calling a fixed effect here. So this is stuff that you're kind of, when you enter the labour market, it's what you are born with when you enter the labour market. It's kind of your innate skills, your innate abilities, anything that's kind of not necessarily education and stuff. And then the lambda thing on it is kind of like, you think about it like the price that the labour market is willing to pay for your skills as your innate abilities, your unobserved innate abilities. And what you see when we look at the distribution over time, so the bottom line here, which I didn't talk about, the green line, is that it's going up over time. What that kind of tells us is that the labour market was willing to pay more and more over time for highly skilled kind of people, for people with higher innate ability over the 2000s. And what was happening then was the labour market was growing super strongly. It seems like there was increasingly people looking around for really highly skilled people. It was getting harder and harder to find them, so they had to pay them more and more, and you can kind of see that. And then over more recent times, it seems to have dropped off a little bit. So that's basically what I meant by that bit.
Thanks very much, Peter Abelson, your interesting talk. Imputed rent at 5%, I would guess that 3.5 would be a more reliable figure these days. Would that make much difference?
No, I should have said that in passing. We play around with that a little bit in the paper. We look at other sort of fractions. We look at letting it vary by where you live, letting the rental vary by what state you're in. It doesn't make any difference to the trends over time. It makes a bit of a difference to how much there is in the level of inequality. So it's kind of up to you as to what your favourite measure is. We have in the appendix, we use a hedonic model to kind of estimate how much people are actually paying on the rent compared to comparable properties. And again, trends are similar. The level moves around a fair bit, but yeah, I don't know what the ideal measure of ideal number is, but. And that's the other thing, yeah, we also played around a little bit actually about, yeah, if rental yields change over time, then that will affect the trend. I can't remember how it affects the trend. We did have a look at that at the time, but yeah.
Hi, Johnny.
Oh, hi.
Hi. So just had the question, because you're accounting for housing prices and rents, is it that these trends are being driven by Sydney and Melbourne, or is it like all over Australia?
Good question. I did not look at the state breakdown in this paper. I have subsequently looked at tax record data. I've got some spares. So I don't have the state breakdown, but this is like a long run trend in what inequality has done, income inequality for Australia over the past 100 years or so. And I broke down the tax data, and what you see actually is it's Western Australia that really took off in terms of inequality over the mining boom period. Now, the problem with the tax data, though, is you can't make adjustments for rent because you don't know if people are homeowners or not. So it's hard to know, but yeah, I could have looked at it by state, and I didn't actually do that. But I'm guessing in New South Wales and Victoria, it'll matter a bit more.
It's worth noting the HES covers the 6 capital cities.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does.
Sorry.
Yeah.
No. I just wanted to ask about well, I guess I've got sort of 2 questions. One about the data sets you've used, the other one about Hilda. So, I mean, my understanding from Roger Wilkins's work is that he's not finding anywhere near the same increase in inequality in disposable household income that seem to be showing up in your results. So I guess that's one question, sort of, whether you've compared. And the other issue is, I guess, the household expenditure survey, my understanding is that it's probably the survey that shows the largest increases in inequality out of the HES, the IDS and Hilda. And I think, for example, Roger's argued that the HES and the IDS have these issues with changes in the questionnaires and so I just wonder, so I've got 2 questions, I guess. One is, have you benchmarked your Hilda stuff against Roger's to what he's finding? And then secondly, sort of, do you think is the choice of data sets an issue sort of in what you're finding?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So I can't remember exactly how our results compare to Rogers trims out outliers and does some other things that we don't do. Like sometimes he focuses on the working age population when we don't do that kind of thing. We have everyone in there. That can matter. In the HES, you're right, the definitions of income change over time. Some might argue that they get better and better and better at sort of capturing the higher end of the income distribution, so maybe that's part of it. So in the paper, we talk about how you also see it in the survey of income and housing as well as the HES. The other thing that's kind of striking, again, in my spares here, so some people seem to like tax data to look at income inequality. Some other people like looking at surveys. I think they've both got pros and cons. But the differences between these 2 things is much more striking in the US than it actually is in Australia. So for me, those bars are looking at, this is the top 10% of income going to, so share of aggregate income going to the top 10% richest people based on tax records, the blue data, versus household surveys, the green data. And yet you could argue that they're slightly different trends over time, but to me the level is really similar and the overall story is kind of the same. The inequality has been going up over the last couple of decades. By how much is still a bit of a question. But however, I've cut it up a whole bunch of different ways and I can't get inequality going down, for example. But yeah.
I was at one of the ABS data seminars about the upcoming census last week or the week before here in Sydney, and one of the questions I asked, and it's one that's just come back every time I even think about using ABS data, is the top coding of income, the income bracket, because obviously there's so much activity going on there, right? This is a big driver of the Gini coefficients and whatnot, and possibly of the difference between your results and Rogers. Do you guys at the RBA have any sort of inroads to the ABS, setting of those brackets? Is there a way that you could get, that we can do more analysis of what's going on in that top 1%, and what industries, what occupations, so that we can try to figure out where the actual issues, are that are really driving up this measure?
This feels a little bit like a Dorothy Dixit kind of question because it's going to let me do a little bit of self-promotion actually for some of the work that we're doing in our research department. So I think that the census isn't really designed for looking at income inequality because it comes in brackets, right, and you've got to make lots of assumptions. But getting your hands on individual tax record data is going to be a lot more promising. And the ATO, I think in the last quarter of this year, will release a thing called the A-Life database, I think it's called, which is longitudinal income tax data. And we're going to be sending some people from the RBA to the ATO tax office to play around with this data, because there you've obviously got no top coding and stuff. You've got everyone, and you've got occupation and industry and all sorts of stuff. And I think that'll raise some interesting research, I hope. I think the Treasury guys, there might be some Treasury guys can talk to that, actually, have already been playing around with some of that data.
I just have comments on your questions. Actually, ABS has the data lab where people can use a much better quality data. I'm not sure if they top codes any income variable, but definitely that they have much better data.
I think part of the problem with the surveys is not even the top coding thing. It's just being able to catch the really rich people on the day. They're not home when the survey people come knocking, basically. But yeah. Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation to present. So what I'm going to talk about today is based on a review article that my colleague Mick Coelho and I had in the Economic Record at the end of last year, sort of, I guess, some parts of that and updated a little bit. I'm going to start out just by giving sort of a really simple overview of some of the stylised facts on changes in earnings inequality in Australia, and then say a little bit about the drivers. Although one of my main messages is going to be that, so I guess everyone would, I think, completely agree with Jane saying about the interest in inequality since 2010, but that hasn't really been reflected in the amount of work on earnings inequality. And I guess I'll point out a few of the areas where, if you're about to start doing a PhD or something, I think there's lots of interesting work to be done. Okay, so just a few sort of stylised facts about earnings inequality in Australia. So this is just taking the ABS data series on persons employed full-time in their main job, their weekly earnings, and adjusting by the CPI to get a real weekly earnings measure. And then for two periods, from 75 to 93 and 93 to 2016, calculating at each decile in the distribution the average annual rate of change in that real weekly earnings measure. And so basically the fact that the series is sloping upwards, that's telling you that people at the top of the earnings distribution are getting bigger increases in their real weekly earnings than people at the bottom. The fact that there's the big gap between the bottom and the top, this is 75 to 93, this is 93 to 2016. Obviously that's telling you that the average rate of growth in wages was much higher in the period after 1993 than in that first 18 years when we had, for example, a series of recessions. The other thing you'll notice is that the increase in the top part of the in inequality in the top part of the earnings distribution was sort of faster from the mid-90s compared to the 75 to 93 period. In the next slide, I just focus on the period from 93 to 2016 and break that up into three periods. And so a couple of things here. So this is the blues 93 to 2003, the greys 2008 onwards, and the orange is 2003 to 2008. And a couple of interesting things there. One is you can see the thing that everyone's talking about, which is that average wage growth in the period since the GFC or since the end of the mining boom has been a lot slower than in, for example, the 10 years after the end of the 90s recession. Interestingly, we have had positive real wage growth on average in the 8 years since the GFC. In the UK, they've actually had, for example, negative real wage growth in that last 8-year period. So we talk about low wage growth in Australia, and historically, I guess it is at nominal wage growth at low levels, but real wage growth actually sort of isn't at historical low levels and not as low as in some other countries. The other thing that's obviously striking is that you notice that 93 to 2003, 2008 to 16 are relatively flat, whereas 2003 to 2008, that's been the period where in that last 23 years when you had really significant growth in earnings inequality. So there's also sort of a story of changing pace of increasing inequality within this period of the last 23 years. You can look at the same data for males and females, and a little bit different, but in very broad terms, the same story for both males and females. So just in summary, higher average rate of growth in earnings post-93, consistent growth in inequality since the mid-70s. In the past 20 years, it was most rapid from 2003 to 2008. Slower growth in full-time weekly earnings post-2008, but with a relatively small increase in inequality. Similar outcomes for males and females. One thing that it's important to take into account sort of with this sort of exercise, especially when you're looking over long periods, is that to be able to do this exercise of using annual data, you can really only use the sort of series that the ABS have published on an annual basis in their publications. This isn't unit record data or anything. And if you do that, and if you want to try and control for changes in hours of work, the best thing you can do is to focus on full-time workers. But if you do that, then you're raising the possibility that that group's going to be affected by composition effects. And so, for example, if you thought that what had happened over relatively long periods, like 20 years, was that some of the jobs that used to be at the bottom of the full-time earnings distribution had become part-time jobs, then what that means is that you'll be artificially lifting up the bottom of the full-time earnings distribution, sort of. So it is important to keep that caveat in mind interpreting these data. Having said that, one thing that is the case is that if you look at sort of weekly earnings measures using the employer survey or using what I still call income distribution survey, you get pretty similar results, or very similar results, both in terms of the extent of change and the timing of changes. Okay, so now I wanted to shift and say something about the drivers of earnings inequality. What do we know about the drivers of earnings inequality in Australia? And so this is just sort of a schema to describe the way that people working on labour market inequality have thought about the kind of factors that in the end change earnings inequality. And sort of got two ways of thinking about it. First of all, there's the sort of, on the far left-hand side, this is sort of just the theoretical or conceptual sort of way that we'd think about the types of factors that might have caused a change or an increase in earnings inequality. So, if we think of the difference between sort of low-earning workers and high-earning workers in a human capital context, then we think of skill as being the driver of earnings differences. And so then it makes sense to think about changes in earnings inequality potentially being driven by changes in the demand for workers with different levels of skill. And we think of international trade and we think of technological change as being factors that might have changed the relative demand for workers with different levels of skill. We think about changes in the supply of labour, the relative supply of labour having different skill levels. So, for example, in Australia, the expansion of tertiary education. We also think then about institutional or non-competitive, if you think of the demand and supply curve sort of determining a competitive wage or set of competitive wages for different workers with different skill levels, we can also think of institutional or non-competitive influences. So you might be thinking about things like decreases in trade union density, shift to enterprise bargaining, changes in product market rents, changes in intra-firm wage setting norms. Then there's the way that we sort of operationalise this set of potential determinants of earnings inequality in empirical analysis. Pardon me. And as Gianni said, the common way to do that is kind of thinking in terms of between and within skill groups, sort of. So that a standard approach is to say, well, look, we're going to think of skill as being education and experience, or we're going to think of skill as being a worker's occupation. And we're going to try and understand the extent to which changes in earnings inequality might have been caused by changes in the occupational composition of employment, or changes in the returns to working in different occupations, with occupation being a proxy for skill. And that's what or education and experience, and that's what we call sort of between skill group. And so, if you thought of changes in the demand for labour affecting the employment, experience sort of composition of the workforce, or affecting the returns to education or experience, then that's going to sort of show up in empirical analysis in this box. Similarly, the supply of labour. If changes in trade union density, if trade unions are distributed unevenly across occupations and changes in trade union density affect the returns to different occupations, then that would show up in the between skill group category. The other category is sort of the within skill group, or the residual category of what you get after you've controlled for changes in the composition of the workforce by skill, education, experience, or occupation, or changes in the return to skill. So this is changes in inequality within groups of workers with, for example, the same education and experience, or the same occupation. And the sort of things that could drive that would be the institutional sort of influences. For example, one example might be occupation. We might have managers, but we know that within that category there's different levels of managers, and maybe what's happening is that the really top managers are getting much higher increases in earnings than the mid-level managers, for example. That would be a within skill group change. The other thing is that the box down the bottom, that's just the idea that sort of even within sort of the categories that we call skill groups up here, like education, there could be changes in, for example, quality going on. So usually our boxes or our categories are quite aggregated, like university degree. And so you might think that sort of what's happening over time, for example, is that there's an increase in the dispersion of quality or the amount of skills that people in this box, university education, have, and that would be having an influence on earnings inequality. And so then together these two categories, between and within, they end up explaining the changes in earnings quality that occur. Okay, so what do we know about the drivers of earnings inequality in Australia? And as I've alluded to, I mean, yeah, it is amazing. Like, I wrote a survey paper in the, I don't want to give you the impression that I'm just doing the same work all the time, but I actually wrote a survey article in the Economic Record on earnings inequality in 1999, 17 years before the last one we wrote at the end of last year. And yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, given the interest in inequality, it's disappointing sort of how little work there's been in that area since then, in a way. And so part of what I'm going to tell you is that, yeah, I think this is sort of an area where, yeah, there's a lot more that sort of could be done. Yeah, certainly when you compare with what's known in the US and Europe about this topic. So what do we know? Well, we do know that not very much is explained by changes in the composition of employment amongst the workforce, or the returns to employment by education and experience. I mean, basically the story is we seem to have had offsetting changes in the relative demand for workers according to skill, and the relative supply of workers by skill in Australia. So, yeah, we've had an increase in the relative demand for workers with higher skill, but in Australia we've had this really rapid expansion in education, which appears to have offset that. And I'm just going to go through a statement of the drivers first, then I'll show you a few numbers to support some of these statements. It does seem that perhaps more is explained by changes in the occupational composition of employment and in average earnings by occupation. And for example, you know, job polarisation being associated, being sort of an example of changes in the occupational composition of employment. This is based on some work that Mick and I have done, but almost occupational sort of almost seems to explain too much, because you wouldn't expect these to be completely uncorrelated, yet we find this doesn't explain very much, and we find this does explain quite a bit. So that's actually a bit of a puzzle we're trying to sort of sort out at the moment. We think there's a role for technological change in explaining changes in the demand for labour by skill level. There's very little work on, you know, given that Australia's open economy, given the sort of interest in given the kind of globalisation that's happened, you know, I mean, yeah, maybe I'm not reading the journals these days properly or something, but as far as I know, the main stuff in international trade and earnings inequality of the labour market in Australia was done back in the 1990s. Farr and Peace at the Reserve Bank, I guess, have the best sort of analysis, I think, that was done on the topic then. But since then, not really much at all on the demand for labour and international trade. Institutional, non-competitive explanations seem potentially really interesting and important to me. We know there's been huge declines in union density, and we know that in the US, those changes in union density have had big effect on earnings inequality. I did some stuff on that back 86 to 94, but I'll show you some data in a moment that shows that in fact the biggest declines in union density have come since 93. So yeah, this is something that we sort of could work on but don't. Intra-firm wage setting, again, I think hugely important topic, but yeah, not really a lot known about it. The other thing is, it's really interesting, I think, this period 93 to 2016, that it's so concentrated, the increase in inequality in 2003 to 8. And I guess, Mick and I are trying to think about sort of, what kind of leverage that gives to think about sort of causes in inequality, that the focus on that period, which obviously coincides sort of with the mining boom period. Okay, so just to support a few of the statements that I made, so this is a table that supports the idea that changes in education and experience don't explain, changes in the workforce composition by age and education, changes in the return to age and education don't explain very much. So if we look at 1982 to 2013, or you can, if you don't like the 82 IDS, go to 86, you get really similar numbers. Basically, you can see that changes in the returns to education and experience, changes in the composition of the workforce, only explain about 5% of the increase in earnings inequality for males, standard deviation of log weekly earnings, and about 20% for females. When you look at changes in the composition of the workforce by and returns to occupation, you find, as I said, a story that there's much more of a story. In fact, it's an alarmingly large story, given that we think that education and experience should be correlated with occupation. It does make some sense that occupation would be mattering, as I'll show, but it's surprising how much from the calculations we've done. Okay, so this is why education hasn't mattered, for example. I think this is pretty well known. Basically, the returns to education have been pretty stable, or actually decreasing, sort of in the period from the early 1980s onwards. And yeah, using the sort of IDS, it looks like for postgraduate and bachelor, especially amongst younger workers, it's still sort of decreasing a bit. So in the period after 2011, and essentially, if you apply sort of the kind of Katz-Murphy approach to thinking about what's happening here, you end up with the result that basically demand and supply in Australia seem to be washing each other out. One reason occupation you do find that why it's sensible to sort of think that occupation would have mattered is this finding of job polarisation. So this is where we classify jobs based on their 1986 earnings, and then we sort of, this is using occupations, 4-digit occupations. The 4-digit occupations are sort of employment weighted in calculating this number, and then we're looking at the period census data from 66 to 2011, and what this is saying is that the occupations that had the 20% of workers who had the highest weekly earnings in 1986, basically their share of employment increased by about 10% from 1966 to 2011. You can restrict it to the mid-80s to 2011 to match up with the earnings numbers, and there's still, the graph looks sort of similar, although the magnitudes are a bit smaller. And then, this is the polarisation idea, this kind of J sort of shape, but with sort of decreases in the share of employment at the lower earnings quintiles. And so you can get the idea that, look, if you've got growth in the high-paying occupations, reductions in the lower-paying occupations, then you're going to be having an effect on earnings inequality. This is just to make the point that technology seems to be having an effect on the demand for labour. So Mick and I had another paper in the first issue of the Economic Record last year where we kind of have done the outdoor type exercise of associating occupations with the intensity with which they require routine skills, abstract skills, or manual skills, and look at the at whether it appears to be the case that there's a movement over time against those occupations which are relatively intense in tasks that require routine skills. So you're probably familiar with the new kind of perspective on technological change, that what computers do is that they substitute for labour that would have performed routine tasks, because what computers do is, you write a program and that program undertakes some task that a worker would have done, and obviously you can only do that if it's easy to sort of codify and write down, if the task's routine. So what this is showing is that basically if you sort of associate occupations with the degree of intensity of doing routine tasks in those occupations, that there's been a shift against those occupations which had the highest degree of routine task intensity in 1966. So this is the change in employment share, and this is 0, and a shift towards those occupations which had the lowest routine task intensity. So, and we show in the paper that we get very similar results trying to explain changes in the composition of employment based on routine task intensity compared to the US and Europe. This is just a point about something that would be good to know more about. We've, like other countries around the world, we've had massive decreases in union density. As I said, I did some analysis for 86 to 94 that showed that decrease in union density could explain about 30% of the increase in earnings inequality for males. And you can see, we've had even bigger decreases in union density since that time. And so I think it would be really interesting to know the extent to which that had been driving changes in earnings inequality. Intra-firm wage setting. So we know that lots of highly paid employees, sort of the top paid employees in their organisations, have had wage increases that are big, even compared to sort of other top paying workers. So you've got the CEOs of the top 100, well, I should say the orange line is the top 1% of average income. So this is people who are pretty well paid. But all of these other groups have actually seen their earnings increase compared to those workers. It's easy to see for CEOs. It's also the case for vice chancellors, that their earnings have increased relative to the top 1%, and similarly for top public servants. So I think this story of intra-firm wage setting norms and as a potential determinant of earnings inequality is really interesting as well. And so, as I said, this is a couple of the papers that this talk draws on, in particular my work with Mick Coelho.
Thanks, Jeff. Great talk. Mark Henry from Uniting Communities. Just wondering if you talk a little bit about the impact of casualisation of the labour market over the period of time you've been looking here, and how much that explains inequality.
Well, this is what we're doing. Well, what I'm just talking about in this talk is really pretty much restricted to people who are employed, full time, and so the only sort of way in which sort of casualisation would be affecting some of the numbers here is if it's causing sort of compositional effects on the full-time numbers. Where where phenomena like casualisation might would matter was if you broadened it out and looked at sort of the distribution of labour market income more generally, and then the effect that that has on household income. So yeah, I can't really sort of say anything about that directly. I mean, one thing that might surprise though is that there's a lot of attention on sort of hours of work, arguably having become less even, the distribution of hours of work. And certainly there are dimensions along which you can think, which that has happened. So, hours of work by education have become more unevenly distributed. Hours of work by household have become less evenly distributed. But it is interesting that if you actually treat sort of just each male and female of workforce age sort of as a separate unit, it might surprise you, but the distribution of work hours has actually got more even in the last 25, 30 years. And the reason for that is that on the one hand, we've had this shift the composition of growth in the percentage of employment, which is part-time employment. And if that was the only thing, if we were just looking at the distribution of hours of work amongst people who are employed, then it would have become less even. But the thing that's actually happened in Australia in the last 25 or 30 years is that there's a bigger proportion of the workforce age population who are in employment. And so what that means, you're knocking out a whole lot of people who used to have zeros, and that's improving equality. So there are different perspectives on that issue, and of course it's easy to guess what underlies that. If you do a Gini of the hours worked for females of workforce age, that's become hugely more even in the last 30 years because of increasing participation rates for females. But of course for males, it's become much less even because you've had males being pushed out of the labour market. So so I think the hours story is more relevant when you sort of move to Gianni's kind of stuff about looking at income and that, because I'm really kind of narrowly focused on just trying to look at what drives the earnings that people who are working are getting. Sort of, it's more when you go to an income perspective.
Hi, I just wanted to say the one thing that really struck me was the graph that you put up previously about when the earnings inequality really took off, and it was basically between 2003 and 2008. Then your subsequent analysis went back to the longer term trends. I'm far from my field of expertise, but I'm just wondering if and you discussed it and you went on slightly and said, well, it could have been something to do with the mining boom. So if you take a look at that small snapshot, what are some potential drivers or some things which might have changed limited to that period and not the longer term changes, stuff which might have changed in 2003 and ceased in 2008, which could have contributed to that, and just limited to that window?
That's something we're sort of doing at the moment, looking at that, and so I can't say sort of too much about, but I mean clearly it looks like the stuff to do with the mining boom was sort of driving particularly sort of high rates of growth for people in the top half of the earnings distribution. But we're still trying to sort of, I guess, trace through the effects on that and comparing across data sets to sort of make sure that it's a really the 2003-8 thing sort of seems pretty robust from the different data sets. But I think so we agree with you that that's really interesting sort of, and it seems that it's something looking at more, and we're doing that. But don't really have anything too much to say about it at the moment.
Can I just ask for a quick clarification? Just so you just said then in 2003, 2008, people who might have been exposed to the mining sector who were on higher incomes might have seen a growth in their income. I just want to be sure, is that the way to characterise it, or is it just that you would see people who are in that income quintile or decile would have had a growth in their income, and it didn't necessarily need to be linked to what income decile or quintile the individual was in previous periods? So, for example, the archetypical story you hear out of Perth is somebody who was a truck driver who was on the minimum wage or an award, who then got a contract driving a truck, and then suddenly their income escalated from not much to quite a lot. So I guess my question is more about mobility in that sense.
Yeah, sure. No, that's important to point about these data, because this isn't like this isn't longitudinal data. This is a series that comes from the labour force survey, so it's a series of snapshots. So this isn't saying that someone who was like a top manager in 2002, suddenly in 2003, that same person got a big wage increase. What this can be showing is basically sort of like composition effects, which is that you've got jobs that were below sort of the highest paying jobs are being pushed up sort of and raising the average rate of increase sort of in that decile. Not necessarily the same job getting a higher rate of pay. It can be compositional stuff that's driving it as well. But you can't really tell that from this survey because and so that's why we're sort of starting to look at Hilda and that a bit to do this, because that's the way we can kind of sort out what's actually happening sort of during this period. But no, we agree with you that this seems interesting.
I just wanted to pick up on your comment about technological, basically skill-biased technological change, because that was sort of the main, economic explanation for increasing wage inequality over the last 40 years. But it does seem like because you're having this increase in the high-paying occupations in 1986, there was that graph, right, which says a lot more people going into those high-paying occupations, and then when they're there, the wage growth is higher. So you see that in the CEO's graph, right? And just really picking up on this question of, what exactly is that? Is it technologically, assisted higher productivity? So is it the case that the vice chancellors are just, surrounded by all these machines that they can, apply their skills to so much better, and they're so much more productive than they were, 10 years ago? Is that a plausible story? Or is there some other reason why those wages are going up, more than those in other parts of the distribution?
So there's two things in what you said. I guess one thing to say about the technology point is that, we're not kind of saying that, look, technological effects are all about computers and automation and that, because in fact one of the really interesting things is that the shift against workers who can do routine tasks goes back to 1966. In the US, where they're doing it, they find it goes back to the 19th century sort of. So this shift, the impetus of technological change to substitute for labour that does routine tasks sort of has been going on for a long time. It's a consistent sort of thing, and so that so when we're saying it may have had an effect on the demand for labour, but it's not something that we think sort of is likely to explain particular spikes in earnings inequality, because it's been rather sort of a smooth ongoing influence on the demand for labour, unless you want to tell a story about the type of technological change has changed. But I think most of the intra-firm stuff, I mean, my gut feeling is it's norms, it's political sort of, it's about the politics of what's happening within organisations, interacted with sort of globalisation of labour markets kind of providing a front for some of the sort of practices within pay setting practices within organisations. So I think it's maybe technology explains some of, I mean, when they've done this in the US, I guess they say, well, look, scale of organisation, some people argue scale of organisation explains everything about the increase in CEO salaries. I think that's disputed sort of. So maybe technology has allowed an increase in the scale of organisations, and that's been partly responsible for, say, growth in CEO salaries, growth in vice chancellor salaries, or whatever. But I think it's hard to argue that that's the whole of what's going on. So.
organising, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to kind of take a little bit of a different view and focus in on older, that is post-retirement age Australians, and present some work that I've been doing with Gary Barrett, also from the University of Sydney. And so we examine and assess the evolution of consumption and income poverty and inequality in Australia. And our approach is to examine the whole distribution of both consumption or income, rather than focusing in on particular indices. And our focus is going to be, sorry. Our focus is going to be on the older part of the population. This segment of the population is clearly of interest for policymakers in terms of the ageing of the population. A greater share of us are going to be in that segment of the population over time. And we're going to be focusing, for the purposes of kind of saving time today, but also out of interest, on consumption, poverty and inequality more so than the income, in the sense that consumption and our measures of consumption are going to be a kind of primary measure of economic welfare or well-being, and the closest thing that we can get to sort of material well-being before launching into kind of a range of other ways of measuring well-being that Carol talked about yesterday. And we're going to be considering the full period from 1984 to 2009, so we are going to also be using those household expenditure surveys from the ABS, and I'll focus mostly on kind of the end points of that time period, but I have a little bit to say about what's been going on in between times. And towards the end, hopefully I'll have a little bit of time to tell you about something that we've been doing at the moment, thinking about the impact of a particular policy change on the distribution of income and consumption amongst elderly Australians, and that's an increase in the single-aged pension that happened in 2009. So a bit more about our approach. So we take an approach in which we're looking at the full distribution of consumption or income and how that has shifted over time. And as a result of studying the shifts in the distribution and assessing whether those shifts are statistically significant, we're able to say something about whether there's more or less poverty, deeper poverty, more or less inequality, and say whether those changes, as I mentioned, are statistically significant. So we're using some methods that Gary has developed with co-authors. So within poverty, we're going to be using methods of stochastic dominance testing, and I'll tell you a bit more about that as we go along. And for inequality, comparing Lorenz curves and looking at dominance relationships between those curves. And these methods are quite appealing because they're robust to the choice of poverty line or poverty index or indeed inequality index. So to give you a bit more on the methodology and to preview one of our key findings, what I have plotted here are the cumulative distribution functions for elderly Australians of their consumption expenditures. And so we've got the CDF, or the cumulative distribution function, in 1984 in the blue line, and for 2009 in the red line, in the red curve. And so what we can read off of this is from that vertical line in 1984, around 85% of the population have consumption expenditures each week of up to $400 in real 2004 terms. But by 2009, that distribution has shifted to the right, reflecting an improvement in welfare, in social welfare. And by that point, only 50% of the population of elderly Australians has consumption expenditures each week of up to $400. So on the flip side, a larger proportion are enjoying higher values of consumption. And we test that difference of those two curves that here are clearly kind of different from one another, but in other adjacent kind of survey comparisons it's not quite as clear. But that is a statistically significant shift in the distribution, and so that corresponds to an unambiguous decrease in poverty amongst elderly Australians over this period between 84 and 2009 for any poverty line and any poverty index. And thus corresponds to an increase in social welfare for any social welfare function that's increasing in individual consumption. So we can do a comparable kind of analysis using Lorenz curves for inequality. And so a Lorenz curve, hopefully many of you have seen before, but here I've got them for 1984 and 2009. And so essentially, the further away the curve is, kind of in a downwards direction from the 45-degree line, the more inequality there is in the distribution. But what we see here is this is for just the elderly population, for their consumption expenditures, that essentially for these endpoints of our kind of time period that we look at, there's actually no change in the degree of inequality. Okay, we've neither seen it go up or down. Okay. All right, and so obviously, and it's already been touched on slightly, there's a very extensive literature, both internationally and locally, on inequality and also on poverty, but for the interests of time, I'm going to kind of not delve into that, but happy to talk to people later, of course. And so I mentioned that we're using the household expenditure surveys, and we're using the data from 1984 to 2009, so 6 cross-sections. We use, for income, we use the measure of weekly household gross income, because that's relatively more consistent over time. It's already been mentioned that there are some issues with the data. And then for consumption, we use weekly expenditures on non-durables. So we have all of the various categories of non-durable expenditure that people report their expenditures on, and then we add in imputed current housing costs, similarly to how Gianni described, using a hedonic imputation method. And we do our analysis at the individual level, using an equivalence scale to get from the household data to the individual level. Okay. All right. So turning to look at some of the data for the elderly in more detail. So here, just to kind of give you a picture or kind of fix ideas, I suppose, here I've plotted average income and consumption, so not looking at the distribution at all, but just looking at how that has tracked over time and comparing the elderly to the working age population. And so we see, on average, rising income and consumption values over time in real terms, but unsurprisingly, the elderly, the level of consumption, the level of income for the elderly is lower than that of the working age population, and also unsurprisingly, the elderly spend a greater share of their income on consumption. And you see similar patterns at both the 50th and the 10th percentile over time. And at the 90th percentile, there's a little bit of a decline for both younger and older people in the early years before a kind of pick up and catch up in terms of their level of income and consumption. Okay, so here is kind of more of these cumulative distribution functions for consumption for the elderly population. So you can still see in amongst that the blue line and the red line for 1984 and 2009. But you'll see that a few things. One, 2009 kind of sticks out, and so we do find, and there is a shift to the right that's statistically significant, and an associated improvement in social welfare between 2003 and 2009 that's quite large, and then amongst those earlier years, there's a little bit more shifting back and forth of the distribution. And I'll come back to some of those movements in a minute. Looking at the inequality, so here, even more of a kind of spaghetti graph where you can't see what's going on. So again, between 84 and 2009, amongst the elderly, we find no change in the extent of inequality in consumption, and nor, in fact, in income inequality amongst this group. But that hides some action in the intervening years. And so we do see that between 1988 and 1993, there was a slight a slight decline in the degree of inequality, and then between 1998 and 2003, there was a slight pickup in inequality in consumption. All right. So I want to say a little bit more about what we can do with this stochastic dominance testing. So essentially it's a kind of an econometric technique for comparing the two distributions that allows you to rank the two distributions in terms of their poverty ordering. Okay, and you can look either, you can kind of look at 3 dimensions of poverty, I suppose. So one, you can look at the incidence of poverty, and that's what I have been kind of talking about so far, and what I'll focus on for the rest of the talk. So essentially, you're looking at 2 distributions, distribution A and distribution B. And if distribution A stochastically dominates distribution B, it means that it lies, the distribution for A lies below that for B, and essentially the poverty head count then is always going to be greater in B for all values of the poverty line. Okay, you can also look at the depth of poverty or the severity of poverty, but we won't get to all of those today. But essentially what we find for the first order of stochastic dominance, for the incidence of poverty, is reflected in our other findings in terms of depth and poverty. Depth and severity, of poverty. So this did end up a little bit too small, so you'll just have to kind of go along with me. So in this table, this presents kind of a subset of our results, looking in the upper half of the table at income and the lower half of the table at consumption. And each column shows you the results of a comparison of 2 years' worth of these cumulative distribution functions, or the distribution of consumption or income. And in the bold words, I've indicated from our testing what is the implied change in welfare across time, so comparing the 2 years or comparing the first and last endpoints of our data set. And so in red, you see the result that I've told you already, that there's been this improvement, and so a decline in the incidence of poverty amongst elderly Australians between 1984 and 2009. And then across, you can kind of track what's happened in each sort of 5 or 6 year period. So there was kind of a little bit of a worsening in poverty in the very early stages in the mid-80s, and then it improved for some time, and then between 1998 and 2003 it was kind of stable again, and then improved again since 2003. Okay, and you can remember from the graph that 2003 to 2009 really does show quite a significant improvement and a significant decrease in the degree of poverty, given the large rightward shift in the distribution at that point. Looking at inequality, we see something, as I've said, slightly different, so that it's remained stable over time. So again, I won't get to the very third panel there, but just in the upper part, the income and consumption, and in words I've told you the implied change in welfare over time, the implied change in inequality over time, and of course stable over the full period, either in income or in consumption. Interestingly, we do have, we do have a similar finding here to what's been pointed out in both previous presentations, which is that even amongst elderly Australians, we see some higher inequality showing up in income between 2003 and 2009. Although once we look at the consumption measures, there isn't a change in the degree of inequality in consumption amongst elderly Australians in that period. Okay. So given that very significant shift in the distribution of consumption and indeed in income between 2003 and 2009, we thought that warranted sort of further investigation of what could be going on there. And so one plausible contributing factor, although it's only going to come into effect at the very end of that period, and this is for elderly Australians, so it clearly doesn't explain Jeff's findings on earnings inequality. But what we see that in Q4 of 2009, there was a policy change that's relevant in this age group, which was to increase public pension support for single Australians. And so single Australians receiving the public pension had an increase in real terms of about 16% in their pension in Q4 of 2009 versus about 5% was the increase for marrieds in the same period. And so that change in the rate corresponds to roughly an increase in the weekly pension from about $250 to about $290 in 2004 dollars. And so our question then is to say, well, given that increase, what can we kind of trace that to a shift in the distributions and the poverty orderings, given that relative increase in the single-aged pension? And so in a sense, we're using this policy as a natural experiment to, within the single elderly population, conduct what we might call a distributional differences in differences analysis. And so we take two approaches to this at the moment, and this is ongoing work. We're still kind of refining this analysis. But one of our approaches that I'll show you today is to think about, well, what happened, kind of our first difference would be, what does the distribution in Q4 of 2009 look like versus in Q3, just before the policy change? And then we want to say, well, maybe something just differs between Q3 and Q4, so we kind of need a control group. So one of those control groups, we're going to look at the 2003 data, so the other, the most recent prior to 2009, and compare Q4 and Q3 there as well. An alternative that we've also used is to look at those that are just before retirement age as our control group and stay within the 2009 kind of economic milieu, I suppose. But I'll focus on the second one today. We find broadly similar results for both methodologies, both approaches, which is reassuring. Okay, so these graphs are not quite so pretty, so again, I hope that you'll bear with me. But in the left-hand panel, so this is income amongst elderly single Australians. Okay, so the curves aren't so smooth because there's fewer observations here. Okay, but and therefore 1 quarter rather than the kind of average across 4 quarters that we can use in the previous analysis. But on the left-hand side, you've got 2003, and the solid line is the Q3 data, and the dotted line is Q4 data. And then in the right-hand panel, you have 2009 data, and again, the solid line is Q3, and the dotted line is Q4. And so you can see, if you focus on the right-hand panel, hopefully, up to around the $500 of expenditure mark, you can see a rightward shift. That is a decrease in poverty or an increase in social welfare up to around that $500 of income that happens between those 2 quarters. And a similar shift is not evident in 2003. And so if we can think about Q4 minus Q3 of 2009 minus Q4 minus Q3 of 2003, what we think that we're finding, and indeed it is a statistically significant shift, is a poverty ordering that in Q4 it's lower than in Q3 relative to the change in 2003. And so the policy change has had an impact on poverty and social welfare in terms of income poverty. Okay, we can do a similar analysis for consumption, but so far less clear, and indeed we actually can't find a significant impact of the policy change for consumption poverty. And so our next task is to kind of say, well, what about at the very lowest end of the consumption distribution, where that change is really going to have the most effect? So in that bottom 25 to 30% of the consumption distribution, that change is really, the change in the pension should have had the largest effect there. And so can we find anything, even if we just kind of zoom in, I suppose, is the idea. Okay. So just to recap very briefly, we've used a kind of statistical econometric technique to consider changes in the extent of poverty and inequality in elderly poverty in consumption and income in Australia over recent decades, and we show that there's been an unambiguous reduction in elderly poverty over that time in either income or consumption. And it's robust to whether you would like to choose whatever poverty line you like, a Henderson poverty line relative to the working age population, whatever line you chose, you would find the same thing. So we kind of encompass all of those results. In terms of inequality, we find no shift in inequality amongst the elderly in either consumption or inequality over that period, although that does hide some variations and in particular, the increase in income inequality in the most recent kind of 2003 to 2009. And with our policy experiment, we've shown that the increase in the single age pension has, as would be expected, increased income for those affected, and that has translated to a decline in income poverty. And we have, we think, some suggestive evidence that there might be some welfare improvements in terms of consumption at the very low end of the consumption distribution as well. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. It was really interesting. One question, and there may not be an answer to it, but obviously you were able to buffer the consumption of those at the bottom. But I'm curious about the increase in income inequality between 2003 and 2009. Was, at that point, were there different returns to different pensions or different assets, or were there different kind of quality of pension? I don't know. I mean, so that it obviously doesn't seem to be bottom driven, the increase in inequality, but was it top driven?
Yes, so it does seem to be top driven. And in fact, if we kind of do different things in terms of Windsorizing at the top of the distribution, that tends to change a bit. So it does seem to be top driven. And so, part of it could be the intervening changes in returns to assets and how that's affecting superannuation and privately funded retirees, whereas the policy change, the pension here is the public pension rather than some private pension.
Okay, that makes sense.
Like Gianni's presentation, the thing that occurs to me with this is, particularly in Australia, when you're doing studies on income distributions, or particularly income distributions of retirees, one of the characteristics of Australian retirees is a very high rate of outright home ownership. So the treatment of imputed rents really matters. Now, your income things pulled off the HES just use the ABS.
Yes, so we haven't adjusted the income measures. They're just the gross household income reported in HES, and then we do the hedonic imputation to kind of bring home owning and renting into line, but we haven't actually done any sensitivity analysis with different imputation methods there for the consumption. So I take that comment, yeah.
So I guess the thing that strikes me on comparing all three of these talks is exactly what you were talking about in relation to the first question, which is that there's this difference between top-driven and bottom-driven, changes in inequality. And when you hear the popular press talking about inequality, oftentimes there's this notion that it's that the reason we should care about it is because of additional suffering at the bottom. Right? Yes. And there doesn't seem to be what the actual facts, or I mean, unless that suffering is driven by, comparison effects, for example, of, I'm doing just as well in absolute terms or relative to my cohort, but there's this other, few people in the society that are doing so much better, I feel worse. I guess I'm wondering whether you know of other sort of more targeted analysis like yours of populations that we think might be vulnerable or at risk, such as youth, young populations who are excluded from getting into the labor force. I mean, that's obviously another big area, and the sort of the fomenting anger that's in there may be driving a lot of the some of the political events. So I'm wondering if you know of anybody else in Australia who's I guess looking at that through the same kind of lens of what's going on with inequality and poverty changes over this period when the top 1% are getting very rich. What's happening to these marginalized groups?
Specifically, I'm afraid that I couldn't mention anyone, but I do know that through the Melbourne Institute there's a lot of work going on about homelessness, and so that's one very vulnerable part of the population. Yes, so I might kind of defer to my colleagues there. Yeah.
Related to what Gigi was saying, I've been reading a fair bit of research on women retired women in poverty, especially widows, and maybe sharing housing. And so I wonder what your results would be if you maybe separate females from males.
Yes, so we haven't done that. So in the sense that I think that there are more single elderly females than there are single elderly males. The kind of final analysis there does touch on that somewhat, but we have not. The data certainly wouldn't support being able to separate single men from single women. There's just simply not enough observations in the data, but we could think about women overall versus men overall, and that certainly would be interesting, I think, particularly in light of differences in superannuation accumulation and so on. Yeah.
Let's thank Rebecca one more time and everybody.